I'm David Levitz. Welcome to the program. Israel has freed 90 Palestinian prisoners as part of its ceasefire deal with Hamas. Early on Monday morning, several buses carrying the detainees left the gates of Israel's Ofer prison just outside the West Bank city of Ramallah. Hundreds of people gathered to celebrate the release, with several climbing on the top of one of the buses. The freed prisoners are said to be women and teenage boys from the West Bank and Jerusalem. They're the first of 1,900 Palestinians Israel is set to release in exchange for 33 Israeli hostages in phase 1 of the deal. And Dr. Hassan Jabarin is with the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Haifa, Israel. He told us more about the Palestinian prisoners that Israel has approved for release.
In the end, based on this deal, in the end, 2,000 persons will be released, and half of them were arrested after the war. So many of the group, they are not heavy political prisoners. Generally, there is satisfaction feeling from the Palestinian side, mainly now because the ceasefire, mainly now because the war is stopped, mainly because you stop the killing, even more than the release of the prisoners themselves. Yes, of course, the families of each prisoner will be happy, but the general feeling of the Palestinian, not because the content of the deal, but because the ceasefire. Now people can know that today you are not going to be killed, and you are not under risk to be killed, not you and not your family.
Earlier, the first Israeli hostages were freed by Hamas militants as part of the deal. 3 women held captive for 471 days were finally brought back home to Israel alive. For other families, the wait continues.
Dramatic scenes surrounded the release of the first Israeli hostages to be freed under the ceasefire deal. Hamas militants made a strong show of force as they handed over the 3 women who had spent more than 15 months in captivity. Doron Steinbrecher, Emily Damari and Romy Gonen were then rushed back to Israel, first to military personnel, and then to be reunited with their loved ones.
Yes.
Live updates of the release played out for jubilant crowds in Tel Aviv.
We've been waiting for a very long time. I just hope she's okay.
Gaza's emergency responders were among the first to celebrate the pause in fighting. Finally able to move around freely, thousands flocked to check on loved ones and see what remained of their homes. But the war has left destruction everywhere.
When the truce was announced, I felt immense happiness. It meant an end to the bloodshed and that children's lives would be saved. But when I returned to Rafah and saw where I used to live, I was overcome by sadness. It looked like an earthquake had struck. The scene was truly horrifying.
While vast areas of Gaza appear uninhabitable, already people are focused on its recovery.
Our greatest wish is to return to our homes, rebuild our lives, and see Gaza restored to a place where we can live peacefully again.
Aid groups wasted no time in rushing in food, water and fuel. Around 600 trucks a day are expected to make desperately needed deliveries. The next release of hostages and prisoners is expected to take place in around a week, with families on both sides of the conflict still desperate to see their loved ones return home.
So a day of high emotions across Gaza and Israel as the ceasefire takes hold, beginning with the return of those first 3 Israeli hostages. DW correspondent Tania Krämer was at the Sheba hospital near Tel Aviv when they arrived.
I think it was a day or an afternoon and evening of mixed emotions. And once, the hostages were driven here, they arrived here by helicopter, and then they were driven here and then brought to this building just here right behind me, where they will be staying, where they will be reunited with their families, have medical checkups and everything they need at this stage. A lot of people here were clapping their hands, were very emotional about their release. I've been waiting like 15 months for them to come out of captivity. But many here also do know that this is just the first batch, so to speak, of the hostages that will be released. The first day in this very, very long process, 42 days of a ceasefire, where we will see 33 hostages being released over a very long time in stages in exchange for Palestinian detainees that are held in Israeli prisons. And everybody here knows, at the same time there's a lot of joy about the hostages that came out today. They were standing on their own feet. You could see that on the photos. They, being brought here as well. But, they seem to be quite okay. But of course, we don't know that much about their medical condition at this stage. But, at the same time, there's always this shadow as well looming behind, because we know that there are still a lot of hostages in Gaza, and people here, hope that this process will actually continue.
Giorgio Cafiero is a Middle East analyst and the CEO and founder of Gulf State Analyst. I asked him if everyone kept up their end of the deal on day one of the ceasefire.
Thank you. Good to be on your program. Despite the fact that the implementation was 2 hours and 45 minutes behind schedule, we have finally began the implementation of the ceasefire. The very first part of this process has begun. And, it's certainly a very emotional day seeing these people who have been detained for a very long time, reunited with their family members. And we certainly hope that the two sides are going to stick to the terms of this ceasefire deal, as tenuous and fragile as it is. What's going to really matter, though, is how the remainder of phase one plays out. And it's going to also be very complicated and very difficult, this process of negotiating the terms of the second phase, which is going to begin in this first phase. Certainly a lot of room for things, certainly a good chance that things will derail, but I think it's also important for us to remain hopeful at this point.
Who's gotten the better end in these negotiations so far, Israel or Hamas?
Well, I think that really depends on how you look at it. And I certainly think that both sides are going to, now with the guns put down, wage sort of a war of narratives. I do think that there is something powerful about the message that Hamas is sending out while Israel began this war in October 2023, saying it was not going to end until Hamas was decapitated, seeing these Hamas militants coming out in public, armed, with the Hamas flags and everything. It is a powerful message. Just the fact that Hamas as a political organization and as a resistance group was able to survive the past 15 months of this gruesome war, like I said, that sends out a very, very powerful message. At the same time, there's no denying that Israel did inflict a lot of damage on Hamas, but more than that, I mean, the type of destruction, the death, the mayhem that's been inflicted on Gaza is just, there's no way to describe it with words. And I think if the Israeli goal was to make just average Palestinians in Gaza suffer for October 7th, there's no denying that the Israelis were successful in terms of unleashing unspeakable amounts of death and destruction all over Gaza. So it's a little tough to say that this was necessarily a win for the Gaza side. But like I said, there's a powerful political message that stems from the fact that Hamas survived this conflict.
Let's talk about the future of Gaza, right? Because on the one hand, there's the humanitarian situation, there's the rebuilding efforts that hopefully now can begin to start. On the other hand, there's the question of leadership, and we have Hamas coming out and showing basically that they are still in charge. Can Hamas continue to rule in Gaza?
Well, I certainly think that's a scenario that's very, very possible. If anything, I would sort of have to assume that that's the likely scenario. I think it's probably either that or an Israeli occupation with full Israeli control of Gaza. It seems a little difficult to imagine the Palestinian Authority coming in and ruling all of Gaza. But I mean, we have to keep in mind, I mean, the vast majority of Gaza is destroyed. When we talk about governing Gaza, I mean, what is it that's to be governed? We also have to consider questions about the siege of Gaza that's been imposed by Israel and Egypt. You know, according to the United Nations, if the siege of Gaza is not lifted, it will take 350 years to bring Gaza back to what it was on October 6, 2023. So, like I said, this question about the siege and whether it'll be lifted and what kind of assistance from outside can come into the besieged enclave is going to be very, very important right now.
Giorgio Cafiero, Middle East analyst in Washington, D.C., thank you so much for your analysis and insights.
Good to be with you.
As the hostage release was happening, U.S. President Joe Biden gave this statement.
The ceasefire has gone into effect in Gaza, and today we're seeing hostages being released. 3 Israeli women held against their will in the dark tunnels for 470 days. 4 more women will be released in 7 days, 3 additional hostages every 7 days thereafter, including at least 2 American citizens in this first phase. We pray for them and their families. They're going to be a long recovery ahead.
Let's come back to Tania Rosanes, our Middle East analyst. We just heard Joe Biden speak there. The deal was on the U.S. side, negotiated by both Biden's people and also Trump's people. Can we expect any change in direction from the new administration?
Well, Trump seemed to be very much, he's torn. On the one hand, he's very much supportive of Netanyahu, and he wants to see, definitely when it comes to the West Bank and settlements, he's not as tough as the Democrats were. But he also seems to be having bigger goals for the Middle East. He's eyeing maybe a bigger deal with Saudi Arabia, something that Biden also was trying to pursue. And for that, he knows that he needs this war to be over, and he needs also the West Bank, to be resolved, and some path for statehood for Palestinians to be guaranteed. And if we see that, Trump, devoted to that path, to a bigger plan for the Middle East, we will probably see more pressure on Netanyahu than Netanyahu was expected when he was secretly, rooting for Trump to win the White House. It's going to be tough, and the test is going to start very soon with the implementation of the second phase. We'll have to see what the American administration, the incoming one, is taking.
And in the last few minutes, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been also speaking about the hostage release.
It is a very moving day. These are the first hostages that we are returning home in this round. And I ask you, Gal, to tell them, Romy, Doron, Emily, an entire people hugs you. Welcome back home.
Shani Rosanes is with me, our Middle East analyst. Shani, a very relieved Prime Minister there this evening. When the hostages were released earlier by Hamas, there was a huge mob forming around this. Maybe we can play these pictures to show our viewers the first step in the release of these hostages. If you look at these pictures, what do we learn there?
Well, we see there the vehicles, the convoy of the Red Cross making it to the center of Gaza City, which was one of the places that Israel thought it had the best control over. And basically, we're seeing here, with the green ribbons around their heads, the Hamas militants, of course, with their weapons up in the air. We're seeing the vehicles where Hamas is bringing in their hostages, surrounded, circled by a mob of Hamas militants, but also just civilians from Gaza. This is, of course, a show of force, very intended and well-planned show of force that chose this location as a symbolic gesture to show we are still here, we are still calling the shots, and this is still our town that we run. And, of course, in such setting, in the heart of Gaza, it was impossible to get a more sterile environment, which I think the Red Cross would have preferred, at least we know this is what they said following the previous deal, where they felt sometimes even that their own people were feeling very uncomfortable and fearing for their lives, because this is a very intense situation. We also know that the hostages themselves have told those who were released in a previous deal that these were the moments when some of them were in the most fear for their lives. Just imagine, after having spent time in captivity, trying to be released into a very intense, chaotic situation as such, with, people with their guns pointing at, screaming at you, of course. But that's part of what we're seeing. We're dealing with an organization, Hamas is a terror organization. They're trying to make clear that, their presence in Gaza is still very much clear. And they seem to be sending a very strong message that also resonates with Israel. You see Israeli media very much, responding to that, to these images of how can it be that 15 months in, after October 7th, Hamas still get to be so strong and so mighty publicly out in the open in Gaza.
Now, from what we've heard from previously released hostages, do you think the three women in that car that we just saw knew they were going to be released?
Well, we've heard several accounts from different people. Some of them said that they were constantly taunted with the idea of being released day after day after day. So you stop believing, you don't really know what to know. It's part of the psychological warfare and torture that they've been going through. Some of them said that they knew very shortly, just a few hours, at the day of the release. We also are not quite sure where they came from. The fact that they were released in Gaza doesn't mean that they've stayed necessarily close to Gaza. We do know, however, that two of them at least were staying together, at least in the last couple of days or weeks, because one of them said to the mother of the other, now after having been released, "You don't know what great service your daughter did to me. We know I could not have survived without her." So we know at least two of them had a personal strong bond that helped them during their time, these 471 days in captivity.
Yeah, talking about this very long time, Hamas was quite successful, actually, in keeping the hostages away from the Israeli army and the attempts to free them. Why and how?
Well, how is a big question. I think some of it was because what happened is at the beginning of the war, we know that Israeli military was not taking into account the fact that some hostages might be around, and we know for a fact that there were hostages that were killed by either direct or indirect Israeli military actions. So at a certain point, there's been sort of a consensus among high-ranking military operatives that they need to avoid certain parts in town where they assumed the hostages are being kept, because what happened was that Israel was just closing in on these parts of town, and eventually, after having treated all the other areas, there were very few areas left untouched, and the assumption was that this is where the hostages are.
Now, this was the first phase today, or the kickoff of the first phase. What's the long-term plan?
Well, first, there's this 42 days ahead of us, which means a new release every 7 days. We're expecting 4 more on Saturday, and then 3 more every week until we make it to the last week, where we'll have 14 released. And at the same time, every time we'll see Israelis released, we'll see a number of Palestinians being released from prisons in Israel. The numbers will change according to the identity and the condition of the hostages being released. That is first one. Phase 2, which is what we are actually hoping to also get into, is the phase which brings the rest of the hostages, the remaining 65, home, and also brings the end of the war. Hamas made it very clear it's not going to make it to the second phase if it doesn't have guarantees that Israel is going to stop fighting. Israel does not want to guarantee that, but however, it does want to bring back the remaining 65. And this conundrum is something that the American and the rest of the mediators, the Qataris and the Egyptians, are going to try to solve even harder after having tried for quite some time in the last months with very little luck. Let's see. One step at a time. So far, I think many people in the region are happy to have one day that they can rejoice and have somewhat of a relief. And let's see where it takes us further.
Shani Rosanes, our Middle East analyst. Thank you,
Welcome,
Shani.
Gerhard.